And my position was always, how do you know that it's a human right unless you talk about why it's a human right and hear the people who don't think that it's a human right? And so I had the Archbishop of Sydney on my radio show, and we, hashed it out. He didn't have any very good reasons as to why gay marriage shouldn't exist. But the existence of the conversation, whilst difficult, was more valuable than my remaining safe.
Correct. And that's what, so you handled that like an adult, right? You had him on, and hey, listen, awesome that he came on your show, right? I mean, that's fantastic. So kudos to him, and kudos to people who are honest with you. And they say, someone says, I don't like gays, I don't think they should be married. You might disagree with him, but that's a person who's honest. You can have conversations with people who are honest like that. But when people are obfuscating,
Peter, the other bait and switch that happens is that if the person does like gays but just doesn't think that they should be married because they have a religious objection to that, they want to preserve that particular institution, but they're not at all homophobic, that position is now erased from the landscape altogether, and that person is by definition a homophobe. Similarly, if you don't, if you dispute what should be done, maybe to address racial inequalities, then you are by definition a racist, even if you're definitely not a racist, which brings us to that word. We've talked about these other words that are getting used. I just want to come back to white supremacy and racism.
Okay. All right. So you just said so much there. I think we can disambiguate terms in a minute. Let's slow down. Okay. So we know that the way to come about consensus and move forward in a democracy, we know it's town halls, it's to hash out issues. I'm not a fan of debating myself because I think that it forces people to stick to a conclusion that they think might be wrong. And so there's a kind of a win element. And so I think conversations are far better than debate, but okay, whatever, debate, conversation. We know we need that to move forward, just like when you had the bishop on. And again, good for the bishop for coming on. I think the first thing I would have said to him is, thank you for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. Because right now we have people who simply won't talk to you about anything. They're completely convinced they know the right answers to moral questions. And so how do we address that problem? So that is not an epistemic problem. That's a moral problem. That's a problem of, as Jonathan Haidt says, in The Righteous Mind, that morality binds and blinds. Morality binds and blinds. So to solve that problem, we need to change the moral mind about how people view dialogue and safetyism. And what's happening now is this idea that they think that they should feel safe is trumping the idea to have honest, open, civil conversations. Was that clear?
That was absolutely clear. Now let's take that to the next component of my multi-pronged octopus of a question, which was about racism, white supremacy, and those terms. Okay.
So the meaning of racism has changed. We've brought in power to the equation, whereas before it was discriminating against someone on an individual on the basis of a racial stereotype. That was what the definition has been for a long time. And I think that's a rationally drivable idea that this ought to be universally morally repudiated, and it is fundamentally odious. But you've added the idea of power. And when you add the idea of power, you, again, from the postmodern notions, and the best source for this is Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's cynical theories, which I mentioned before. When you add the notion of power into the equation, it completely changes it. So, for example, that's why on this new definition, people in the majority or people in positions of power, like white people, only they can be racist, but people absent that power cannot be racist, like, for example, trans people, what have you, in the oppression hierarchy. And so that's a meaning of a word that's recently changed. I mean, look, you can ask, well, what about white farmers in Zimbabwe? They don't have power. I mean, you can just think of some pretty simple examples of how to work through this. But again, that's the emerging theme in this conversation. In order to even do that, you have to know what the opposing side is. You have to know what the best, and not just a straw man. That's why it's good that you invited the bishop. Like, you have to invite in really smart people who are true believers to have those conversations with them. And that is not happening in the university.